Hello, I'm Rosemary Case, Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'd like to thank People with Disability Australia and Queensland Advocacy Incorporated for the opportunity to participate in this important side event. This side event provides a critical forum for me to present a contemporary understanding of how intersectionality is embedded in the human rights framework, and specifically through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. The Convention was the first human rights treaty adopted in the 21st century. The Convention shifts our understanding of disability from one of individual deficit requiring care, treatment and protection systems to a human rights model that affirms that all people with disability are of equal worth and value and must be afforded all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with others. Central to this is the recognition that disability is one of several layers of identity. Preambular paragraph P of the Convention acknowledges the different layers of or intersections of identity and recognises that this can result in intersectional discrimination and inequality. Other international human rights treaties have also recognised different layers of identity, but the Convention is the first human rights treaty to explicitly and comprehensively address intersectional discrimination. Intersectional discrimination recognises the multidimensional layers of identities, statuses and life realities that interact with each other at the same time in such a way as to be inseparable. It acknowledges that people with disabilities do not experience discrimination and inequality as a homogeneous group. While intersectional discrimination is specifically articulated in the Convention in Article 6, Women with Disabilities, and Article 7, Children with Disabilities, it is critical to recognise that Articles 6 and 7 are illustrative of intersectionality and not exhaustive. So the Convention does not contain specific articles or references to LGBTIQA+ and identities and population groups, or to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, or SOGI-esque issues. But it's clear that the Convention recognises intersectionality broadly. The broad concept of intersectionality is reflected within the work of the Committee and is essential for progressing the rights of all people with disability. Our committee is one of the youngest in terms of our establishment and so are likely to have a lower number and percentage of documents referring to LGBTIQA+ SOGI-esque issues. However, the committee has made important progress in the inclusion of the rights of LGBTIQA+ people with disabilities, particularly through several general comments and numerous concluding observations following the review of states parties. The committee's work can only reflect the issues that are brought forward during the state party reviews and individual communications. While we may be aware of the types of issues confronting people with disabilities from LGBTIQA+ communities, without concrete information and evidence from civil society of the situation within states, it is difficult for the committee to raise the issues. The committee has been active in terms of recognising the sexual and reproductive rights of people with disabilities, in terms of LGBTIQA+ and SOGI-esque issues. The committee has focused under Article 15 and Article 17 primarily on recognising intersex genital mutilation and the need for states parties to prohibit sex-affirming medical interventions without the consent of the person or without waiting for a child to be able to provide their own consent. Along with prohibition, the committee has also recommended the need for adequate counselling and support to families with intersex children and the provision of redress to intersex persons who have been subjected to involuntary medical interventions. A key reason for this focus has been the information and evidence provided by intersex people and their representative organisations to the committee, and the growing recognition that intersex people often identify as people with disabilities. Intersex people are medically labelled as having disorders of sex development and face ableism as a result of the societal response to impairment, in the same way as other people with disabilities. The committee has more broadly focused on LGBTIQA+ and SOGIESC issues by, for example, recommending the need for measures to protect people with disabilities from conversion therapy, ensuring that transgender and gender diverse people with disabilities have equal access to health service, including gender-affirming healthcare, ensuring equal access to assisted reproduction for LGBTIQA+ people with disabilities, and ensuring support measures to facilitate political participation and social agency. It is critical that LGBTIQA+ people with disabilities are visible and active in the disability community, so that their issues and concerns are recognised and addressed. This requires support for groups and organisations of LGBTIQA+ people with disabilities, and a focus on LGBTIQA+ membership within broader disability organisations. States parties need to ensure that their disability data collection is disaggregated by LGBTIQA+ status, and for this disaggregated data to inform policy development and implementation, including in the area of sexual and reproductive rights. There are also important partnerships that can be made between people with disabilities and LGBTIQA+ communities. As an example, I note that the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, ILGA World, has developed a knowledge database on laws, human rights bodies, advocacy opportunities, and news related to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristic issues worldwide, including in relation to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is an important resource in supporting the advocacy of the disability community, including LGBTIQA+ people with disabilities. It's the work of standalone LGBTIQA+ groups and groups within the disability community that facilitate the progress of human rights law and the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Engagement by LGBTIQA+ groups with the committee, informally and formally through state party reviews, individual communications and inquiries, as well as forums and activities such as this side event today, will enable our committee and the broader human rights framework to progress the rights of LGBTIQA+ persons with disabilities and provide guidance to states parties in implementing their human rights obligations. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. What a great honour to be speaking to you today and sharing some of my stories. A proud LGBTIQ plus Wiradjuri man. But I'd like to just do a quick acknowledgement before I speak in the language of my father's people and my people. So I'd like to say Yamadumarang, which is hello, I hope you're all well. Yuanara Mavaba Paul, which says hi, I'm Uncle Paul, that's my name. Dirramadilia Bardu Wiradjuri, it says that I'm a proud Wiradjuri man. I'm proud to be Wiradjuri. Live in Dirrabang, Gubba Gubby Jinnabara country, which says I now live in the beautiful Gubby Gubby Jinnabara country here on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and Yiri Mulidor Nadimunijang, which says I will always respect my elders. So today I'm having a bit of a conversation with some of my experience and some of the cultural background of being a First Nations man living with disability who also identifies as LGBTIQ+. I use the term many spirits because I think LGBTIQ+ is a lot to say all the time. And to me, many spirits, I take that from the Canadian point of view where there's the two-spirit people. So when you have a disability, I say there's many spirits because our disability and our sexuality all forms part of our spiritual identity. And this is an artwork I did to help me explain a little bit of our culture. So it's a bit hard to put it all in 5 minutes, but I'll do the best that I can. In First Nations culture here in Australia, there's no bad dreaming stories about many spirit people, which is a way that we know that it was just an accepted thing. There was some research done in the early 2000s with some communities, and it seems evident that to be part of the many spirit or LGBTIQ plus community was just part of the diversity of our culture. There's no bad dreaming stories. In fact, Min spirits, the well-known Min spirits, are actually known to be gender neutral. So I did a bit of an artwork here just to explain myself with some of this sort of thing and some of the issues that we're going through at the moment still here in this country. So here we talk about the fact that over here, this is in the beginning. There's no bad dreaming stories. As I said, it's just part of diversity. There's no bad dreaming stories about many spirit people. In fact, some of the artwork and the symbols used may actually say that it was quite commonplace. This shape here, the U shape, represents a person, and it's actually gender neutral. You actually have to augment it to make it male or female. And if you don't augment it and you're doing a story, it will revert back to female, which is how we all start anyway. But this basically talks about the fact that there's no bad dreaming stories prior to colonisation in this country. And then we had a lot of influence through introduction of Western religions and Western philosophies in regards to gender, where it's brought down to just two genders. And that had a huge influence on our communities. And now, here in this country, like to be a member of the LGBTIQ plus community, you're already a minority group. If you're an indigenous person who's LGBTIQ plus, you're a minority within a minority. But if you add another intersection onto that of being a person with disability, Indigenous, and LGBTIQ plus or many spirits, you're actually a minority within a minority within a minority. And that plays a huge part on our culture and how we, as people with disabilities, get to interact and be accepted and play our part in community. And there's resources and supports around that may not meet those needs. So some of the things we talk about here too is the fact that sadly, that the suicide rate with our young people is 3 times higher than a non-Indigenous community. And we just wonder if that's an impact of our young people trying to discover themselves in remote communities. Some of the remote communities, it's very much a thing where we don't talk about it. People identify as gay, but it's not mentioned. It's not talked about, which might be a nice thing that they just go about their life. But the sad thing too is if it's not talked about and not recognised, they often don't get the right health supports and medical supports that they need. Some of the medications needed for a transgender person is very different to someone who's not transgender. And if they don't identify, it can have a huge impact on their health. So these are the things that's nice to say, I'll just coast along, we don't talk about that stuff. But it's really hard to get cultural supports and proper supports if you're a person with a disability in remote communities and that as well. I know myself, bringing in supports with my disability, I was very conscious of the organisations coming in. A lot of them are very faith-based as well and still have those issues. But we used to do a thing called straightening up and trying to get anything that made us look like we're part of the gay community. So we still have a lot to do and a long way to go, but we're getting there. Now, there's some really good things happening in community here in Australia. Our government recently is having more conversations with us here. But also recently, 4 years ago now, the same-sex marriage debate, which made it legal for same-sex marriage to happen in this country, had a huge impact on respect and acknowledging the community and our relationships. And it started a lot with community where people were sort of starting to fit in and just become more mainstream and being accepted for who we are. But unfortunately, there's still this gap with our remote community members who are still living isolated without the resources and the supports. And I think we need to remember that the LGBTIQ plus community or many spirits community, it's not all glitter and feather boas and partying. There's some serious stuff happening. And we need to look beyond that and start supporting our communities out in the regional areas and our individual people. Even recently with World Pride here in Sydney was amazing. But honestly, the cost to get there for anyone out of Sydney was so expensive. Accommodation was ridiculous. So it still just catered to all the glamour. Everything was done as glitter and wonderful and feather boas and partying. But it missed a lot of the stuff and issues that are still happening within our communities. So it's not all feather boas and glitter and glamour and big wigs. There's a lot of other stuff we need to start looking at and doing that as well. And we're getting there, but we have to keep the conversation going and we have to support a mob who are isolated and not getting those supports. And to be able to sit down and have a conversation like this today is amazing, and the opportunity to start that conversation. So let's keep it going, let's keep talking, and let's keep doing the right thing for our mob.
Before I begin this panel discussion, I'd like to thank Uncle Paul and Rose McKay for providing their remarks and reflection. I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I am speaking from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. My name is John Carlo, and I use the pronouns they, them. I'm a non-binary person with disability. I'm also the Senior Manager of Policy at People Disability Australia, which is a national peak body that represents the 1 in 6 Australians with disability. And I'm also the immediate past President of the Australian GLBTI Multicultural Council, which is a national peak body that represents multicultural and multi-faith people from who are LGBTQI here in Australia. For those who can't see me, I am wearing pink turquoise glasses. I'm a person of colour, and I have a brightly coloured shirt on as well, and I have black hair, and behind me are a desk and computers. Today, I'm here with our panellists Mo Quirk, Annabelle Oxley, and Ruby Mountford, who I'll ask to introduce themselves shortly. These panellists will discuss and reflect on their own lived experience of being LGBTQI+ with people with disability. Key things that we'll be exploring in today's panel discussion include the fact that there's a common interest between the disability and LGBTQI plus communities to protect the autonomy and agency of people with disability from societal interference that promotes a hetero-normative, cis-gendered, and able-bodied norm. The fact that we share a common experience of the diversity amongst the disability community and the LGBTQI plus communities from being erased in response to medical and social expectations, promoting a heteronormative, cisgendered, able-bodied norm. We'll also be discussing the unique issues that LGBTQI plus people with disability experience, especially when seeking and accessing disability supports, and situating that conversation in the historical context of social services being delivered by religious providers. And lastly, we'll be focusing on new ways in which we can ensure that sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and intersex rights are protected in the disability community. Through discussing these things, we seek to better understand how to ensure that people who are LGBTQI plus people with disability are accessing the supports they need. So let's meet our panelists. I might throw to Mo first. Would you like to introduce yourself, Mo?
Hi, I'm Maurice or Mo. I use he, they. I'm a PhD student in religious studies at the University of Sydney. I have experience with mental health issues and with autism, and I am also a transgender man.
Thank you, Mo. Annabelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am Annabelle Oxley. I am a transgender woman with experience of homelessness and the need for high levels of care due to having cerebral palsy. I also work as an advocate and as a trainer for the intersectional disability program for the Queensland Council of LGBTI Health. I use she, her pronouns. And for those of you who can't see me, I have fair skin, mousy blonde hair, and I'm wearing a pink cardigan. I think it's pink.
Thank you, Annabelle. And last but not least, and Ruby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ruby Mountford. I'm the Disability Chair for ILGA Oceania, which is the Oceanic Regions section of the LGBTIQ plus International Federation known as ILGA World. I'm also an LGBTIQA plus Inclusion Advisor in Community Health. I'm President of Melbourne Bisexual Network, and I do a lot of lived experience work around the intersections of autism, gender, and sexual orientation as a bisexual, androgynous person. For visual description, I'm a white person. I have hair that's been shaved at the sides and pulled back in a bit of a coif to give me like kind of mohawk vibe. And I'm wearing a top with lace and a high neck like I'm a Victorian governess. But Victorian governess's androgynous queer cousin is kind of what I've been going for.
Thank you, Ruby. And clearly, we have a very fashionable group of people with us today, and such a diverse range of experiences. And so, thank you so much to the panelists for being here today. So, let's kick off with a question of what it's like being an LGBTQI person with disability. We all have different experiences, and so it'd be great to hear from each of you. I might start with you, Annabelle.
I believe the best way I can describe my experiences is that in a lot of ways, because my disability was very physical and I'm also transgender and queer, it felt like I had to divorce myself and my identity from my body in a lot of respects. I feel like there's a lot of pressure, especially when you're dealing with personal care providers, for you to be able to remove the boundaries that a normal person would have, and those boundaries become even more important when you have gender diversity, as gender diversity often presents in ways that aren't cis-normative or heteronormative. So in a lot of ways, my experiences are best described as trying to balance two identities while developing both. And in that sense, a lot of growing as a trans person has been discovering my identity beyond purely the medicalization of disability, and instead viewing my experiences as more of a fusion of disability culture and queer experience, and rebuilding the idea of privacy in the private sphere, which is often stolen from disabled people by virtue of the care we require or need. So I would best sum up my experience as a duality of identities that are often considered conflicting.
That's really interesting, Annabelle. You touch on quite a few issues there. Mo, do you want to explain your experiences, or talk us through your experiences being a person with disability as well as being part of the LGBTI community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Annabelle said about the idea of the disparate nature between gender identity and disability is really interesting, because I have kind of like a very different experience. For me, my gender identity and my autism are very entwined because there's a lot of shared experience between autism and having gender dysphoria in terms of feeling as though there's something that other people can kind of get about fitting into society, that I always felt I didn't really have access to, like I missed a lesson somewhere. And part of me coming to terms with my gender dysphoria, one of the big steps in that was coming to terms with my autism and the ways in which I generally feel like I don't fit in. And I know that a lot of gender diverse and transgender people are autistic. And I think that's really interesting, especially given that, I mean, that fact has been used by transphobic groups as a kind of invalidation of trans identity of, well, you know, a lot of trans people are autistic, so obviously we can't trust them to be self-aware and to reflect on their own identities, and we can't trust them based on what they say about themselves, because they're autistic, they don't know. And I think there's this compounding of the fact that autistic people aren't believed often about their autism and also about other aspects of their experience. And trans people often aren't believed about various aspects of their experience. So those two things together are kind of treated as, well, we can't trust you on either of these fronts. Therefore, I can't treat your identity as valid because I don't acknowledge the legitimacy of either aspects of that identity.
Thank you so much, Mo. Ruby, I feel like, did you want to, what's your experience been like as someone who's a person with disability, as also a member of and a very active member of the LGBTI community?
Professionally queer. I think it's been a similar experience to what's been discussed, but I think for me, as someone who was diagnosed later in life when I was 25, and as someone who has identities around sexual orientation and gender that are often seen as not quite real enough, even within the SOGI or the LGBTIQA plus community and advocacy, being bisexual and non-binary, I found that it was it had some benefit often to find pride as a person with diverse sexual orientation and gender. You have to unpack a lot of internalized shame and a lot of social messages around not fitting in and not being worthy, and not really seeing people like you in successful places or being happy and healthy and loved. But I think, so it's a journey that once you've gone on once is much easier to find again. So I'm very grateful that as somebody who is autistic and that I am also queer, because I think it would have been much harder to find pride in myself as an autistic person without having first found it as a bisexual person and as a non-binary person. But to echo what Mo was saying, I think there has been an increasingly quite tactical and bad faith argument around the decision-making capacity of people like me when it comes to our gender. I think it's between at least 30% of trans identifying people, and of course, trans is just a term that we use here in the Western society. There's a lot of other different cultural terms for people who are gender diverse, but it is at least 30% of people in that category meet the criteria for autism spectrum. And I think that's a really significant number. So it's that matter of, again, recognizing that that is something that is a really common co-identity and a common intersection, and is being targeted as a way to try and delegitimize trans identities in part of what is a global movement to push back against what's been quite a serious progress in identifying and the visibility of gender diverse people. But for myself, I do think that I was part of the very beginnings of the wave of people who were born and socialized as women, recognizing we've been missed in a lot of the criteria around autism and ADHD, because, and this is an issue generally, a lot of those criteria, particularly for the conditions I live with, or the diagnoses I live with, the differences I live with, that are part of my brain, they're based on the behavior of white middle-class men, boys really. And I think I've also had to recognize that often being diverse in sexual orientation has been treated like a disability, and the overlap there has been pretty insidious. But I think there's, for example, ABA therapy, or applied behavioral analysis therapies, which is something that a lot of autistic advocates feel very strongly is quite a cruel and degrading and inhumane treatment, was the same person who invented conversion practices in the medical sphere for homosexual people. So I think as I've continued to work in this space, the overlap, I think, with disability and diverse gender and sexual orientation and intersex status has made the way that we work together and the wholeness of identity and the need for wholeness of identity even clearer, as it's also helped me understand just how particular Western models of medicine do really attempt to split us into very neat categories. And as someone who lives on a spectrum in all aspects of my identity, I have found that there is a lot of both pain and joy in being fully cast out of what is considered to be normal. It's helped to make me a much more compassionate person and to understand models of disability and to recognize just how important it is that any social justice movement is ensuring that it is fully inclusive of every aspect of a person.
Thank you very much, Ruby. And look, it's as you were talking, it made me think about all three of you really touched on it. This idea of expectations, either from the medical community and from society, and how that shapes what it means to be a person who is LGBTQI with disability. Like I know, for me, for instance, you talk about non-Western notions of gender. I identify with the buckler identity, which is part of my Filipino culture, and that's influenced how I get supports. So I'd love to hear from all three of you around what you think those expectations have shaped your experiences getting the supports that you need to realise your full human rights. And Annabelle, you touched on this already, so I might throw to you actually. How has that shaped your ability to get supports?
I believe it has shaped my ability to get support in two ways. One is that disability is often viewed in an incredibly medicalized sense. Everyone in this room knows that. However, when we discuss medicalization, we aren't talking about medicalization in the sense of just a diagnosis and a criteria, but the objectification of a human being down to their base elements and parts. Your disability becomes overriding, and expectations around your disability become defining in how you can express yourself. For example, I started transitioning 7 years ago at the age of 23, but there was a lot of skepticism because there were no earlier signs of gender experimentation or open dysphoria. But when you look at it through the lens of, particularly in my case, physical disability removing the agency of experimentation that one would normally have in that area, you often find that you lose that sense of early understanding of yourself, which is often seen as a factor of legitimacy. And then, inversely, within the queer community, I think there is, particularly among binary transitioning, a trend towards extreme femininity or extreme masculinity, particularly at the beginning of your transition, and not being able to accurately express that to either support providers or other members of the community can often lead to people questioning your legitimacy because they view wanting to achieve those feminine goals or stereotypes as something that you should automatically be able to do. For example, if a person in, let's say, residential care or supported independent living, as it's called under the NDIS in Australia, if someone in that position identified as female, they would need the support of their support workers in order to present as female. Presenting as female gives two things. It gives safety, and it gives a much easier path when going through the medicalized transition process. If a person with a disability can't do those two things because of restrictions placed on them by care, then you have someone who's not only isolated from their disability support, but potentially from our notions of LGBT support as well. And this creates this unseen third community that is otherwise underutilized. And as a result, there's no funding or research or protections put in place because there aren't visible queer, trans, or diverse disabled people because those bodies aren't able to present in ways that our culture understands. Does that answer your question well?
Absolutely. Anyway, you touched on quite a few things, particularly around this tension between the LGBTQI plus community and the disability community. But for the benefit of our viewers, I thought I'd quickly define the NDIS that you mentioned. The NDIS is one service system that delivers disability supports in Australia. It's probably the main one. It's not the only one, but it's quite a unique service system globally. So. I'm really intrigued to hear from Ruby next, actually, on this because I know you've worked with a provider before. How has expectations from the medical community and society influenced both your experience as a person with disability as part of the community? And how have you experienced getting the supports that you need, both as a person who might need to receive those supports, but also need to provide the supports too?
Yeah. Thanks, Giancarlo. So I did work with Aspect, Autism Spectrum Australia, on their Rainbow Advisory or the LGBTIQA plus advisory for about 5 years. And I think what I was finding there was, again, that generally service providers are quite unaware of LGBTIQA plus identities, as we call them here in Australia. And I think that's also, it does become a huge issue because people with disabilities, we are often reliant on help. And so that does mean that we are, without support from our families, from our carers, it is very easy to stop us from accessing information around gender, around sex in general, around sexual orientation, around intersex status, it's easy to stop us from accessing our communities. And so I do think that when it's come to my experience of trying to find help, I actually was involved in a research project here in Australia, which led to an article being published about the experience of LGBTIQA plus or gender diverse and and people with diverse sexual orientations with disabilities in healthcare settings. And it was found that we have to choose which part of ourselves we want to talk about in any one time. So basically, what it generally means is that I have to put up with non-inclusive service providers if I want to have my needs as an autistic person met, that I have to just put up with some indignity, basically, and often I get treated like a child a lot, I think, when people find out I'm autistic. That's something else, much like with my sexual orientation, I do have to come out as autistic and often explain what I need. I work in a professional environment in health, but health settings are often here. There aren't actually a lot of people with disabilities working in health, community health systems. That's due to a lot of issues. It is due to, in part, funding, but also in part because medical spaces do tend to hold to quite strong hierarchies of information. And so there's a sense that lived experience, we are slowly starting to recognize that as a form of expertise, as a form of knowing and having knowledge that is of value in medicine, but it's slow. And I think also in the Australian setting, there's a constant we use a model that is very focused on deficit, and so on examining the things that I should change in myself to be happier, as opposed to the ways that my life could be made better and enriched by changes outside of me, because I can't change that much. I can change my hair, and I can change how much of my behaviors I show and how much I just internalize, and what that does to my mental health. But I think it's difficult. I think generally when I've talked about it, I think dealing with the stigma that comes with being like having a diverse sexual orientation, and then the thing I find is not just with care providers, but also being able to access my community as a queer person, and then having to deal with the misunderstandings and the stigma that happens there. There's that sense of never really totally feeling like all of you is understood and all of you is supported. And that is not just about, of course, being able to be happy. This is a sense where it means that I have to put myself at big risks, particularly when it comes to my sense of well-being, but also my bodily autonomy and my safety. I also am aware that, like a lot of autistic people and a lot of bisexual people, I have lived experience of sexual violence, which is a really common issue. And I think I often butt up against this idea that disability is inherently desexed and that we all are non-sexual people. And I think that's something that I've really have found difficult to hear and to work through in LGBTIQA plus spaces, where there is often a lot of emphasis on those things, while there is also a lot of frustrations. I think Annie Finger once wrote, and I got this from Jax Brown, who's an incredible Australia-based LGBTIQ disability advocate, was that sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It's often the source of our deepest pain, and it is often easier for us to talk about and formulate strategies for challenging discrimination in employment and education and housing than to talk about our exclusion from sexuality. And the disability rights movement has struggled to include, historically and presently, sexual rights in its understanding of the disadvantages that we face. And so I think that's been something, one of the biggest things has been in finding services, is service providers who are willing to acknowledge that we have a sex drive and that we have a sexual orientation at all. I think that is something that I run into a lot, not just when I'm looking for care for myself, but with my other friends with disabilities and from their experiences, is that it's very difficult to gatekeeping from our families and our carers does tend to assume that any relationships we have that are romantic or sexual or both are dangerous for us. And there's no real dignity of risk. Everyone should be allowed to date the wrong person sometimes, you know. I think that's something that I've noticed, is that there's an assumption that we don't get to take risks that everyone else gets to take, whether it's with our money, whether it's with our hearts.
Absolutely, Ruby. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head when it comes to what we need to learn within the two communities that we occupy, that we exist in. Like, what can the LGBTQI plus community learn from the disability community and vice versa? And the right to sexual expression and sexuality is very much something that is a unresolved thing here in Australia. And it's definitely something that we need to explore more. So, Mo, just on that idea of what can be learnt from, or can be learnt between the two communities. What do you think, the LGBTQI plus community needs to learn from the disability community and vice versa to ensure that, that we're all fully supported, like Ruby said?
I think what Ruby said about sexual and gender liberation in disability is really, really poignant. And the idea of having the ability to exist as people with, and exist as full people who are disabled and who are queer. And I think something that the disability community can learn from the queer community is, for one thing, fighting against pathologization. Sorry, I pronounced that wrong. In terms of, obviously, being gay is formally a diagnosis of mental illness. Gender dysphoria continues to be a diagnosis of mental illness, which is very contentious, obviously. And I think taking those approaches from liberation from diagnosis and pathology is something that's really relevant to disabled people in terms of obviously medical support where necessary, but like disability as a way of being rather than a diagnosis, I think is really poignant. And obviously what queer people can learn from disability is a lot of inclusion of disabled people, better approaches to accessibility, and focus on people who have various levels of social privilege rather than just liberation for people who already have, in other ways, a great deal of social privilege. Yeah, that's the gist of, I think, what we can learn from each party can learn from another.
You really started to touch about this idea of what needs to change. And so before I go to that question, though, I might just throw to Annabelle. What do you think needs to change? So what do you think the LGBTI community needs to learn from the disability community, vice versa, to feel like you're supporters in your own way?
I feel like the disability community has often placed itself and been placed as a form of monoculture within various forms of disability. And when I say monoculture, I mean when you to take what Ruby said, for example, a lot of what autism is in media, in the way that we think, is modeled after white young boys, and a lot of what we think of when we talk about the deaf community and the hard of hearing community comes from the singular portrayals of Helen Keller and the able-bodied assumptions they're in. And a lot of the time, those monocultures lead to people within those communities being shut in terms of access to new experiences, and also the ability to grow as individuals. To use an example from my work, I was teaching a group of advocates for intellectual disability in South Australia, I believe, about the importance of sexual education. And they're like, how do we frame this so that parents don't view it as dangerous? Because people with intellectual disabilities become infantilized. And then I had to sit down and I had to explain that access to that knowledge is not in itself a danger, but it is instead the ability to gain better understanding of yourself. And the destruction of that monoculture would then allow us to create a less combative way of being as a community. Because, at the risk of going too deep, a lot of the disability community historically has fought for funding, has fought for the attention of the mainstream, and has fought to be recognized. In breaking down the experience of the monoculture in a way similar to how the LGBT community accepts the different forms of orientation and diversity exist, we can create a more holistic way of being that doesn't automatically make disability hierarchical or combative. In terms of what the LGBT community can learn, I feel like there has always been a fear of imperfection within the disability community in the physical sense and from the sense of civil action. And the disability community often discusses the idea of the good cripple and having to dismantle the idea of disability and being a good model of disability. I feel like we as an LGBT community need to embrace the less than TV ready or less than easily explainable parts of our culture, and instead focus on portraying authentic ways of being, if that makes sense.
It absolutely made sense, Annabelle, and what a very erudite insight that you provided us. I think that's really interesting around this monoculture, and we are a diverse community, and we need to capture that to ensure that the supports we need reflects that diversity. And so you talked about, with your example you gave, Annabelle, you talked about education as a way of moving forward in the work that you did. Like, that's obviously something that needs to change. We need to educate people. But what else needs to change to ensure that supports for LGBTQI people are being met? And so to answer that question, I might throw to Ruby, and I might ask if you can reflect on your experience as the ILGA chair as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose a big part of what needs to change is that people who are signatories to the UN Convention of People with Disabilities need to refresh themselves on how General Comment 7 explicitly states that, a disability is no reason to prevent someone's expression of gender identity and sexual orientation and of being an intersex person, and all the things that contains in all the various different ways that gender and sexual orientation are understood and expressed throughout the world. So that's the big one, I guess, is to really recommit to the convention and all of its comments. But insofar as both is my time as chair for ILGA Oceania, but also I recently had the privilege of convening the Caucus of People with Disabilities at Sydney World Pride's Human Rights Conference in March this year, which feels like a long time ago now. And what we were finding that what needs to change, particularly from that sense, was there has to be an understanding of building relationships and the need for people with disabilities and their organizations to work with us and to proactively seek us out. I think that it can often be a hesitance or there's an assumption that we're not in the room because that space has not been welcoming enough for us to share, that we've been there the whole time. And I think so that's something that to see more of an onus, particularly in spaces where people with disabilities and their organizations are working closely. In the Pacific, there's a particular focus at the moment on ensuring that evacuation procedures in the cases of increasing climate emergencies are accessible for people with disabilities, that the spaces they're moving to will be able to be fully used by people who use mobility devices, particularly. And those things also need to be safe for people who are gender diverse and who are diverse in sexual orientation and who are intersex as well. So I think it's that sense of recognizing that you have to start from the beginning with a framework of who else might be in here. I know that we have done a similar thing with people with disabilities when it comes to addressing gender, specifically with the inclusion of women and the need to focus on that and to not just treat disability inclusion as a blanket thing that will automatically include all. So I think that within that, looking at gender, it's to move it further than just looking at cisgender women and to look at to ensure that it's inclusive of all genders. And I think particularly one thing that needs to come up is also recognizing that for a lot of countries, mobility and the laws that we have around, as we're looking to see an increase, as we're witnessing backlashes against SOGI or LGBTIQA plus peoples around the world with recent, really a cracking down in laws that are criminalizing us from birth. And this means that we need to have mobility to leave. Unfortunately, a lot of countries, including Australia and New Zealand, make it impossible for people with disabilities to become citizens if they've come into the country. And it's important, I think, to recognize that when we are addressing any issue in this space, we are also addressing that there are forcibly displaced people with disability who are LGBTIQA plus or SOGI. And that we have to remember that these are two communities that exist across all geographic, all economic, all ethnic, and all religious cultures and spaces. We exist everywhere. And as Annabelle was put so well, we are not homogenous. Within disability is an umbrella term for such a huge range of things, just as SOGI or LGBTIQA+. We are basically just saying different than, right? But I think so far as what needs to change for supports, the issue could also be, I think as you mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of disability support services around the world are religious or based in religion. And so I think there needs to be an understanding of the pressure that puts on people with diverse sexual orientation and diverse gender expression to remain closeted, to remain hidden, and or if they even have enough information to find that about themselves at all. So I think there has to be, when we do international support in those spaces, or when we are building up and reviewing the human rights that are being upheld, people with disabilities, that is a factor we are looking at around how religion, if religion is being used that way. And I know religion is not always, but I know that we need to address that it can be. I think also we need to really decolonize our idea of disability. And this, of course, comes from the incredible privilege I've had to work around how in the Pacific, LGBTIQA plus liberation is commingled with decolonization. A lot, in part, it's because a lot of the bills that continue to criminalize same gender attraction and acts are leftovers from British or other European rule, and were not part of their culture, were introduced. And I think our ideas of disability have been introduced, and the colonizing structure is what continues to create this need to label and to rank the human experience and the value of people based on our closeness to what is seen as the colonial ideal. And I think that's something that needs to change by disability services and LGBTIQA plus organizations and peak bodies and advocacy spaces and human rights movements to really reconcile with how we talk about sexual orientation and sex in general, the fact that people with disabilities have sex and have sexuality, and that people find it difficult to imagine us having sex in a straight way, let alone a gay way. So to kind of really reconcile with seeing us as full people, with service providers to do the work to make sure they can understand and safely affirm us and support us, and when needing what governments can do in that space. So, for example, often if there are grants being awarded around Pride events, is it possible, if there's something that an organisation or a universal or global aid space is doing, are they also stipulating you need to have a plan to make sure people with disabilities can access what the resources you're making, the events you're organising? Often I think that's how it starts. It does start with putting prompts in with funding to say, on both sides of the table, I suppose. So LGBTIQ plus funding needs to stipulate what is your plan to make this disability inclusive, and disability funding needs to stipulate what is your plan to make this inclusive of people of diverse sexual orientation, gender expression, intersex people, and of course, everything else within that, different ethnicities and different religious practice. So I think that's kind of where it starts. It's recognizing that there needs to be, from the beginning, a criteria around how we're building up movements and how we distribute funding for that space.
Well, thank you so much, Ruby. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the nexus between decolonisation, disability justice, and as well as just liberation in general. But Mo, we don't have much time left, but I did want to ask you, we talked very high level about what needs to change, but I wouldn't mind going back down to a practical level. What hasn't worked? What doesn't, and what have you seen work? If you can give us maybe a short answer to what you've seen work and what you've seen that hasn't worked.
Yeah, so I mean, the first and most obvious thing that doesn't work is tokenization, and just saying that, we have one queer person in this disability community, or we have one disabled person in this queer community, that's enough. It needs to happen at a grassroots level, that in disability groups, queer people with disabilities are treated as leaders, and in queer spaces that queer people with disabilities are also treated as leaders. It needs to be holistic and comprehensive rather than just kind of ticking a box. And that, as we've discussed throughout this panel, is about structure and identifying the systems that inherently keep queerness and disability as being considered as disparate concepts. there is a need for acknowledgement of how those two concepts are kind of like cannot be separated for so many people, because that experience of difference is experienced in terms of both disability and queerness. And so I think the things that have worked are ensuring that on a structural level, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. So there's not that many examples of places where it's been done really effectively in a really, really prominent place. But the strategies that have worked in this and in other similar contexts are ensuring that change is treated from a structural level rather than just putting diverse people into a situation where the structures still don't support them. Because it's not enough to just have people there. There is a need to ensure that they are supported and that they have resources and that they are given the ability to advocate for themselves effectively. And that comes not from tokenization, but from a comprehensive reassessment of how we talk about disability and queerness.
And you're absolutely right. I think we do really need to start thinking about the solutions at a structural level. So that brings our time together to an end. It's been a very enriching conversation. I wish we had much more time than we have today. But I do want to say thank you to Ruby, to Mo, and to Annabelle for your erudite insights as well as your reflections for today's panel. And for the next part of this event, I'll be throwing to Alexander Ladd for closing remarks.
Thank you. My name is Alex Ladd and my pronouns are he, him. I'm a male presenting person with brown hair, wear glasses, and have a dark business shirt. I work as a solicitor in Brisbane, Australia, and have advocated for the rights of people with disability, the LGBTQIA+ community, and older persons. I also previously worked at the National Disability Royal Commission for around 3 years. I have lived with a vision impairment since I was born and identify as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am recording these closing remarks today, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also acknowledge the land designated as New York City to be the homelands of the Lenape peoples. In the preceding panel discussion, panelists discussed a variety of their own unique experiences and highlighted the additional barriers individuals face as being people who identify as LGBTQIA+, or live with other forms of disability. A key concern highlighted by panelists was the expectations imposed by medical professionals and the refusal for LGBTQIA+ people to take reasonable risks, impacting on access to vital treatments and support services for LGBTQIA+ people living with disability. The assumption imposed on LGBTQIA+ people with disability, including anglicisation and desexing, the varied sexual relations LGBTQIA+ people with disabilities have, and the impact of family and domestic violence within our community was also highlighted as being excluded from the broader disability movement. Further, a fundamental lack of understanding for LGBTQIA+ people with disability and associated support needs is lacking within Australia, and seemingly very much the case to worsening degrees within other states' parties around the world. Although the CRPD enshrines the right to home and family within Article 23 and health, including sexual and reproductive health, Article 25, LGBTQIA+ people with disability, especially gender diverse people and those with intersex variation, continues to experience significant barriers to ensure their rights are fully implemented for all people across the world. In November 2022, the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability commissioned a research report into the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people with disability, recognised the importance of better understanding the societal factors that influence the diverse experiences and needs of people with disability who also identify as LGBTQIA+. The research report, entitled Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of LGBTQA+ people with disability, a secondary analysis of data from 2 national surveys, was conducted by researchers from La Trobe University based in Melbourne and provides insights from over 5,000 responders from all Australian states and territories across 2 surveys conducted in 2019. The report found that LGBTQA+ people with disability experience higher rates of violence and abuse due to their gender identity or sexual orientation. Despite progress in parts of the world in recent years, respondents still indicated high levels of being closeted and feeling unsafe in a variety of settings by both adults and those under 21, with a lower level of acceptance experienced within family settings as compared to amongst friends. Such feelings of not feeling accepted were reported as being highest within healthcare and medical settings, with 34.5% of adults representing such concerns. The findings indicate concerning rates of mistreatment continues amongst young LGBTQA+ people with disability aged 14 to 21, including findings that 52% experience verbal harassment due to their sexuality or gender identity, 15% experience physical harassment due to their gender or sexual identity, and 31% experience sexual harassment or assault. Further, of adult LGBTQA+ people with disability who contributed to the surveys, 58% of people with severe disability experience verbal abuse due to their gender or sexual identity, compared with 32% for LGBTQA+ people without disability. 36% of people with severe disability experience harassment due to their gender or sexual identity, compared with 19% of LGBTQA+ people without disability. The report also found that more than 2/3 of respondents experienced violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Even higher rates of violence were experienced by LGBTQA+ adults with disability from family members. Respondents also indicated low levels of satisfaction with responses upon reporting such incidences of abuse. LGBTQA+ people with disability also indicated limited supports that accorded with their needs, provided by disability support providers and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's important to keep in mind that despite various disability-specific organisations existing across Australia, these organisations often do not provide disability-safe or queer-friendly services to people. Although these findings offer a rare analysis of the experiences of LGBTQA+ people with disability, it also highlights the limited understanding society still has on the experiences of intersex people and the ongoing barriers they face to inclusion and impacts on their fundamental human rights they often experience from a very young age, especially in relation to forced sterilisation. Key recommendations within the report include better training for disability support organisations to improve understandings and implement safe and accessible responses, greater research into the experiences of underrepresented cohorts within this community, including First Nations people, people with intersex variation, and trans and gender diverse folk, updates to government policies on health and well-being to include the experiences of LGBTQA+ people with disability, increased and ongoing funding and strategies to improve inclusion of LGBTQA+ people with disability in all services, community settings, and meaningful involvement of LGBTQA+ people with disability at all levels of service delivery and policy making to ensure society is better informed by their lived experience. The final report of the Royal Commission will be published in September. It is hoped that the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people with disability that were shared during its public hearings program, via submissions, through community engagement activities, and outlined within powerful narratives based on private sessions held, will further shine a light on our underrepresented community and afford national attention to the need for change. Critically, such change rests with broader societal attitudes and services as reflected within our panel discussion today, not with the individual's existing identities. These findings overlap with some of the experiences shared during this event's panel discussion and further highlights the clear need to commit to sustained research on LGBTQIA+ people with disability to strengthen existing services and address negative societal attitudes to reduce such rates of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Conferences such as COP16 is in a unique position to continue this dialogue and begin to, in the coming years, to address some of these concerns and systemic issues that affect LGBTQIA+ people with disability. It is also vital that we, as LGBTQIA+ people with disability, or people like myself who belong to both of these often overlapping communities, continue to advocate for the safeguarding of individual autonomy and agency from societal interference that all too often promotes a heteronormative, cis-gendered, able-bodied system and society. Thank you again for watching today's side event. I'd like to express my thanks to my fellow contributors to this important discussion today, Rosemary Caius, Uncle Paul Calcott, Giancarlo De Vera, Mo Quirk, Annabelle Oxley, and Ruby Mountford. We invite anyone in the New York area to meet at the UNHQ security checkpoint after the proceedings today, Thursday, 15 June 2023, for informal networking and to continue the conversation from today's event. Thank you again for watching.